Hey everyone, time for another video, and this time we'll be looking at the Intel Pentium D 925. Unlike regular dual-core CPUs, the Pentium D 925 is effectively two Pentium 4s on a single chip, as it has two separate Pentium 4 cores stuck together to form a single CPU. The Pentium D 925, released in Q3 of 2006, is a dual-core CPU with no hyper-threading support on the LGA 775 socket from Intel. It runs at 3 GHz from the factory and doesn't support turbo boosting in any way, but has plenty of overclocking headroom to increase performance, as we'll see later on. It's based on the Presler architecture and built using the 65nm fabrication process, and features 4 MB of L2 cache, 376 million transistors, and an 800 MHz frontside bus, all with a TDP of 95 watts. It had a release price of $133, which adjusted for inflation is around $164 today, or £116 or €133, but can be bought in the UK for the grand total of £1, or $1.41 or €1.14, but even at £1 there are better alternatives that are cheaper than this. We will be testing its stock and overclock performance in a couple of benchmarks, which are Cinebench R15 and SuperPi 1 million. And we'll also be testing it in a few games which are Witcher 3, GTA 5, Crysis 3, and Rise of the Tomb Raider. The system we'll be using today features 8GB of DDR2 RAM at 800 MHz, a GTX 1080 from my personal system, Windows 7 Ultimate 64-bit, and the Phanteks TC14PE to keep the 925 cool. So let's get into the benchmarks. First up is Cinebench R15, a benchmark designed to test your CPU's ability to render a photorealistic 3D scene. The slowest CPU I've tested so far in Cinebench was the Celeron D430, which took nearly 25 minutes to complete the benchmark. The Pentium D925 completed it in 9 minutes 28.89 seconds, so time to speed it up again. Pentium D925 completed the benchmark with a score of 71. However, when overclocked to 4.35 GHz, a quite frankly staggering overclock of 1.35 GHz over stock, it achieved a score of 104, 46.5% increase over the stock score. With this overclock, the RAM was now running at 967 MHz compared to the 800 MHz stock. Next up is SuperPi 1 million, a single-threaded benchmark which calculates pi to 1 million decimal places. We'll be carrying out 10 runs of SuperPi 1 million and taking the fastest time from those 10 runs. At stock, across its 10 runs, the Pentium D925 took a pretty slow 43.094 seconds to complete the benchmark. When overclocked to 4.35 GHz, with the RAM at 967 MHz, the 925 managed a time of 29.797 seconds, a 13.297 second reduction from the stock time. First up for our games today is a favourite of mine, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, which we will be running at 1080p on the lowest settings. Witcher 3 released on 19th of May 2015 on PC, Xbox One and PS4. It's a sequel to The Witcher 1 and 2 and is based on a series of novels by Polish writer Andrzej Sapkowski. Excuse the pronunciation if it isn't correct, as I can't speak Polish. You control the central character, Geralt of Rivia, in a request to find his missing adoptive daughter Ciri, and a vast open-world game with several side quests to keep you occupied. At stock settings, the Pentium D925 made for a pretty horrible experience in this game, with the most frustrating of issues being complete lockups lasting several seconds. The FPS constantly dipped to single figures, and when the game wasn't busy locking up, there was some input lag as well, which with the stuttering and lockups made combat possible but extremely difficult. I was hoping overclocking the Pentium would make it a bit more bearable, but at a speed of 4.35 GHz with the RAM at 967 MHz, the game was still a mess, with people missing their entire upper bodies being a particularly amusing issue. The game still constantly locked up and stuttered just as badly as at stock, proving the game to be completely unplayable on the Pentium D925. Across a 30-minute fraps benchmark, At stock, the 925 achieved an average of 19 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 9 and 3 frames per second respectively, and at 4.35 GHz it achieved an average of 20 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 9 and 0 frames per second respectively. Next up is GTA 5, which we will be running at 1080p on the lowest settings. GTA 5 released on 17th of September 2013 on Xbox 360 and PS3, 18th of November 2014 for PS4 and Xbox One, and 14th of April 2015 for PC. GTA 5 is centred on the lives of Michael, Trevor and Franklin, and is set in the fictional state of San Andreas, which is based on Southern California. It was a pretty poor show for the Pentium D 925 in this game. At stock, I didn't even bother running the Fraps benchmark as it was impossible to play this game on the processor. There was constant input lag, dips to under 15 frames per second, and complete lockups of the controls, making for some quite hilarious gameplay, with cars and characters running in circles due to the inputs freezing. Combat is also impossible due to the input lag and low frame rate. I went straight to overclocking not long after starting the game, hoping that it would at least make it playable enough to run a 30-minute Fraps benchmark. At 4.35 GHz, with the RAM running at 967 MHz, the game definitely fared a bit better, although it did still suffer from minor input lag and frame rate dips under 20, with stutter when rotating the camera as well. It was sort of playable, but definitely not enjoyable in any way, with an average of 30 frames per second and 1% and 0.1% lows of 15 and 11 frames per second respectively. Next up is Crysis 3, which we will be running at 1080p on the lowest settings we can. Crysis 3 released on 18th of February 2013 for PC, and is set in a version of New York City in the year 2047, in which you take on the role of Prophet. Fraps won't display in this game for me, meaning I can't run a benchmark, with severe input lag and constantly under 10 FPS, making gameplay completely impossible. Overclocking to 4.35 GHz with the RAM at 967 MHz vastly improved the performance. However, it was still a pretty poor experience. The game still had input lag and the FPS was constantly under 20 frames per second. It was much smoother with FPS nearly triple what stock clocks managed. Not that that matters much though, as less than 20 FPS in a game like this makes it a pretty horrible experience regardless. Lastly today is Rise of the Tomb Raider, which we will be running at 1080p on the lowest settings, with DirectX 11 due to Windows 7 not supporting DirectX 12. Rise of the Tomb Raider released on the Xbox One and Xbox 360 in November 2015, and 28th of January 2016 for PS4, and 11th of October 2016 for PC, and is a sequel to 2013's Tomb Raider. It's set 1 year after the events of the previous game, and follows Lara Croft as she embarks on an expedition to discover the Divine Source, a supposed source of immortality, before an organisation called Trinity find it first. The Pentium D had a fair bit of trouble running this game, and that at stock speeds it locks up and stutters fairly badly, with FPS dipping pretty close to single figures, and I also experienced some input lag as well. This stuttering and the lockups together with the input lag caused me to die several times when trying to make a large jump, as the game would freeze mid-jump. Overclocked to 4.35 GHz with RAM at 967 MHz. The game ran smoother, but still wasn't a great experience. The game stuttered pretty badly when walking through water, and combat was still reasonably tough due to the stutter and still present lockups. Across a 30-minute Fraps benchmark, the game averaged 23 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 6 and 2 frames per second respectively, showing just how unplayable it is at stock. Overclocked, it managed an average of 31 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 11 and 6 frames per second respectively. It was close to being playable at parts, but the stutter and lockups were almost unbearable in others. Overall, the Pentium D 925 was pretty fun to test, especially in overclocking. It managed over 4.3 GHz and may have gone further still, had the motherboard allowed me to. For games, it's a no-go though, with performance in modern games being horrible at best. If you liked this video, consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel for more content like this. Hopefully you tune in for the next one.